You've taken in a lot already, and now we're gonna finally start cutting up your video. I remember cutting up my first video. Every snip, wonderful. We're creating art here. Come on, let's go. So you're gonna wanna bring your footage over into the timeline. I've mentioned the timeline a few times now. This is probably the most important panel in all of Premiere Pro. It's where your footage, audio effects, and absolutely everything that you want in your video will go. To start, let's take a piece of footage from your project panel. That's where we originally imported the footage to, and then drag it onto the timeline. And presto, that piece of footage is now a part of your sequence. When I refer to the sequence, I'm referring to the clips and audio that form an individual timeline. If you have multiple timelines, you will have multiple sequences. But that's not something we need to concern ourselves with at this stage. You can see here that there are now two blue blocks on the timeline. The top is the video, and the bottom is the audio attached to that video. You can tell which one is audio because it has the audio waveform on it. That's this little thing right here. Another way to pull footage onto the timeline is to use the in and out tool that I mentioned in the shortcuts section. This is used when you want to pull a specific segment of your footage onto the timeline instead of the entirety of that footage. This is really simple to do. First, double-click on your footage in the project panel. This will make a preview appear in the source monitor above it. In the source monitor, use the playback options to find the moment that you want to pull into the timeline. You can just hit the spacebar to play and pause your footage. When you're at the beginning of the moment you want to bring into your timeline, press I for in, then move the playhead along the footage to the moment where you want your clip to end and press O for out. Then all you have to do is drag the footage directly from the source monitor onto the timeline, and the footage between the in and out markers will then appear on the timeline. This is really useful if you want to scrape through your footage and choose just one part rather than having to cut through the entire piece of footage on the timeline. You can also choose to pull only the audio or only the video from the clip onto your timeline. In the source monitor, underneath your preview, there are these two buttons. The left one looks like a piece of physical film, and if you click and drag that onto the timeline, it will move only the video onto the timeline. The other looks like an audio waveform. Click and drag that, and it will take only the audio and put it onto your timeline. I personally use these quite a lot, especially with some of the memes where you just want the audio or video separately. So it's well worth knowing. So your first piece of footage is on the timeline, and as we can see, that footage is now appearing in the playback panel above the timeline. This is where you will see what your final video is looking like. And when you move the playhead around on the timeline, it will show the corresponding moment in this panel. You can click the play button in the view panel to watch your sequence play out, or you can press the spacebar, which will play and pause your footage here too. And look at that, our video is playing. We're making a video. Once you've put your first piece of footage onto the timeline, your sequence will change to the same frame rate and pixel ratio of that piece of footage. The rest of the sequence will now be in that format. Let's quickly double check that our settings are all correct in the sequence section. Go up to sequence and then hit sequence settings. As you can see, this sequence is 3840 by 2160 pixels and 59.94 FPS because the footage was 3840 by 2160 pixels and 59.94 FPS. When you pull in other footage that's not at this size, it may appear strange, either really big or really small. For the moment, if this happens and your footage isn't fitting the sequence, right-click the footage that's the wrong size on the timeline and click Scale to Frame Size. Your footage should now look correct, and we will go into how to manually zoom later on. A note on the sequence settings. This is where you can change the size of your project. If you're making a HD project, you can set your footage to 1080 pixels tall and 1920 pixels wide. Or if you want to make something specifically for socials that's 9 by 16 in size rather than the 16 by 9, you can change the horizontal number to 2160 and the vertical to 3840. However, for this course, I'm going to be working in the classic 16 by 9, which is standard for YouTube, but the options are there to work in different styles of video. Now let's move on to the real juicy stuff, cutting your clips up. This is really easy to do. Just press C on the keyboard to activate the razor tool. Your cursor will change into this little razor. When your cursor is the razor and you click on your footage on the timeline, it will cut up your clip. Now let's have a go. Whoa, you've just done your first cut. Cutting up your footage splices it into two parts, meaning we now have two separate bits of footage on the timeline, which we can drag around. In this example, I want to take out this boring moment. So I'm making a cut either side of the boring moment, then pressing V on the keyboard to turn back to the normal regular cursor. With the normal cursor, I'm going to click on the isolated boring moment that's in the middle and press delete. And bam, you've just removed that boring moment. And now you can drag around your footage on the timeline by simply clicking the footage you want to move and dragging it with the mouse. This is how you'll be arranging your footage and audio on the timeline. If you drag one clip on top of the other one, then you'll remove what's underneath from the timeline. Chances are you don't want to do this, as you want to play around with the position of both pieces of footage without removing one of them from the timeline. The best thing to do is to stack the footage and audio on top of another using different layers, or as Premiere calls them, tracks. This will give you multiple layers, and the footage that's on the top layer will be the one in the playback panel and the one that will ultimately show in your final video. Let's use an example. I'm going to drag this footage above this other piece of footage on the timeline. As you can see, the footage that's above the old footage takes priority. You can also see that the audio moved to another layer. However, it doesn't matter which audio file is on a higher level, as both of them will be playing. This allows for layering multiple audio files. We will also eventually add layers of footage and effects that are both showing at the same time, but we'll get onto that later on. A pro tip here: if you have layered audio and footage and want to cut the entire timeline at a single point, then hold Shift whilst using the razor tool. It will cut all of the tracks from top to bottom that are in the same place, which is called a ripple cut. If you accidentally cut too much footage out, then you can easily expand the ends of the footage on the timeline, and that footage will still be there, no sweat. As long as the original source remains in the project panel, all of the footage deleted from the timeline is recoverable. All you have to do is use these red handles and drag the ends of the footage, and instead of moving the footage on the timeline, it will expand the footage out. You can also use these handles to make the clip shorter. Alternatively, if you have two pieces of footage next to each other on the timeline, you can select the ends of both of them at the same time by pressing N. This will bring up the rolling edit tool. This is essentially the same as what we did with those handles, but it's going both ways. Now, when you click on the cut that's between the two ends, it will expand and detract the clips on both sides. As you can see in the preview panel, this can be really useful when working out when you want one clip to change into the next. Press V once more to return the cursor back to normal.
An extra tip: if you cut somewhere and you don't want there to be that cut anymore, you can remove that cut point by clicking it and pressing delete, or right-clicking and pressing join through edits.
Let's talk about selecting multiple clips. You can select a whole load of stuff on the timeline all at once by clicking on a blank space, holding that click, and moving your mouse. This will create a box that will allow you to select multiple clips. If you have a clip selected and want to also select another clip at the same time that maybe isn't next to it already, press Shift and click on the second clip, and now both are selected. To select another clip on top of those two, Shift and click another clip, and so on and so on and so on. Now moving one of those clips will move all of the selected clips. Something else to note when it comes to selection: you can easily select everything that's in front of your cursor on the timeline. Press A on your keyboard and your cursor will turn into the Track Select Forward tool. This will allow you to select everything in front of the cursor on the timeline. Again, press V to return to the normal cursor. Alternatively, press Shift and A and it will select everything to the left of that cursor, also called the Track Select Backwards tool.
Now let's return to the moment where we first cut up our footage and we removed that middle boring moment. Let's use undo all the way back to that point with Control and Z.
You see that blank space where we deleted the footage that we didn't want? We don't want blank spaces. And now you're going to want to remove that blank space in the most efficient way possible. As we've learned, you could drag that footage that's in front and pull it back to fill in that space. That's what I used to do, and I know a lot of amateurs still do this. However, this can get really annoying if your timeline's getting full and there are loads of clips. Instead of selecting them all every time and dragging them back, just select the blank space in the middle of those clips and click delete. And boom, you just got rid of that space and saved a good few seconds of your time. I really wish that I had known that from the start of my editing journey. So far, when we've moved or cut our footage, we have also moved and cut the audio linked to that footage. If you want to start moving around just the footage or just the audio, then you have to unlink them from each other. Just right-click the footage or audio and click Unlink. You can also click the footage or audio and press Ctrl-L on Windows or Command and L on Mac, and that will unlink the video and audio from each other. Now you can move around the audio and video separately on the timeline.
You can tell if a video clip is linked to audio because there's this tiny little V next to the file name.
To relink audio and video, select the two things that you want to link and either right-click and press Link or use the same shortcut, Ctrl and L or Command and L. And of course, if you have footage of someone speaking and you want to unlink the audio from the video and start moving things around, the audio will go out of sync with that person's voice. However, this is a good tool if you want to just remove audio from some footage and have music playing instead. This is also really helpful for a technique called J-cutting. A J-cut is when you let the audio from one scene bleed into the next. For this example, I'm going to unlink my audio and video, then I'm going to expand just the audio with the red handles. Now, the audio from this moment continues into the next one, but the footage does not.
I hope you're enjoying it. You're editing.
One last tip for this lesson. If your footage playback is choppy, then you can change the playback resolutions, because the most important thing at this stage is having footage that plays smoothly, so you can understand how it's going to flow. To change the playback resolution, just play with the settings right here underneath the preview window. And don't worry, this won't affect the final product at all. If you're playing back the video in 480p, but have the project set to 1080p, the render result will still be a 1080p HD video. This lowered resolution is just for preview purposes only. For some computers, you'll be able to play back at full resolution with no lag. You lucky, lucky people. But don't worry if yours can't. Not all of us have been blessed by the computer gods. It's just important to make sure that you're saving your work as you go, because if a dreaded crash does happen, you don't want to be stuck back at square one. Reminder, the save shortcut is Ctrl-S on Windows and Command-S on Mac. So now you know how to cut up your video and arrange your footage onto the timeline. How you decide to cut up your clips is completely up to you. One thing I will stress at this point is just making sure that your video has good flow. There's no magical formula to good flow. It's just something that you feel, and the best editors will have a great feel for flow. If you want to know what good flow is, then go and watch your favorite films and YouTube videos. And instead of just watching, start actively thinking about the editing. What has been left behind for you to watch? Are there any blank, boring spaces? Are people talking over each other? And how quick are the cuts? And are there too many cuts? It's these sorts of questions that great editors will be asking themselves whilst watching videos. And you realize that everyone has a different style of editing. Your editing style will be completely dependent on what sort of videos you are producing. A cinematic, slow burn story has a completely different style of editing to a gaming YouTube video. So now that you know how to chop up your footage, just have a go with it. Get used to using the in and out functions, using the razor tool, deleting dead space and moving multiple clips around. These are the foundational elements of cutting up your sequence. So take your time and play around. Watch this video again if you need to, and don't worry about making something impressive right now. This all takes time. And once you've had a go playing around in Premiere, let's go over some quick timeline navigation in the next lesson to make working on your sequence even easier. I'll see you then.